printed in Part B of House Report 112-62. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk in order under the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, in the nature of a substitute, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-62, offered by Mr. Cleaver of Missouri.
Pursuant to House Resolution 223, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, and a member opposed, each will control 15 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Congressional Black Caucus has offered an alternative resolution to the budget proposals every year since 1981. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the Congressional Black Caucus, and we have, over those years, served as the conscience of this body. And I stand in front of you today to say that this is perhaps the most important of all of the alternative budgets offered by the Congressional Black Caucus. And the reason is that, Madam Chair, we believe that someone must stand up for the vulnerable population. And the vulnerable population is not what we generally like to think. It's not the stereotypical view of a person who doesn't work and is shiftless and is a parasite. The vulnerable population today consists of firefighters, police officers, municipal workers, state workers, factory workers who've been laid off through no fault of their own because of this weak economy. And those men and women have been struggling, trying to make it. And somebody must stand up for them. They're black, white, brown, they're old, elderly. Some of them are at an age where it will be difficult for them to get another job. And so somebody must stand up for them, and we have decided that it will be us. Now, let me just say that these are some weird times. We do have a budget deficit, and we would not at all suggest that we don't need to deal with the budget deficit. What we need to do, however, is deal with it in a way that will protect the vulnerable populations. Madam Speaker, I have a left knee that is artificial. It is a prosthetic result of football injuries. And once I recovered and left the hospital after the surgery, my brain automatically forced the rest of my body to pay attention to the sick side of my body. And so I automatically, even though I tried not to, did everything I could do to protect my left knee. I even put most of my weight on my right knee. And what I am saying is that our bodies provides us with a message that when some part of our body is vulnerable, is weak, the other part, the strong part, needs to do everything it can to protect the weak part. The Congressional Black Caucus is saying that our alternative budget does exactly that. When you consider the fact that the gaps in after-tax income between the richest 1% of Americans and the middle and poorest fifths of our country more than doubled between 1979 and 2009. So we can see that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and when I hear people say that we must have shared sacrifice, I disagree. The poorest people don't need to sacrifice. I'm not sure that you can find a single poor person who is responsible for the economic collapse of the last 2 years. Mark Zandi, an economist with unimpeachable Republican credentials, said that 1.7 million people will lose their jobs in the first 2 years if this budget is enacted. And so, Madam Speaker, we intend to present our budget now to demonstrate how this body can protect its weak side and still maintain the best of this republic for the protection of its people. I now, Madam Speaker, reserve 2 minutes for the gentleman from Virginia. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 15 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to yield myself 3 minutes.
The
Madam
gentleman
Chair,
is recognized for 3 minutes.
thank you. Madam Chair, I'm so glad that we're going through this process this year. I think this is a healthy part of what we do as the United States of America, what separates us from a lot of other countries. And I'm glad that we're actually doing this. You know, this is my second term in Congress. Last Congress, last year, we didn't even go through this process. I think this is healthy. I think we all care deeply and we're very patriotic about this country. But I happen to have a vision that says that the proper role of government is somewhat limited, and that there is a proper role for government, and that we need to adhere to that proper role. You know, it's funny, sometimes I hear opposition to the Republican proposal, the Republican budget, and I hear that we're going to sacrifice this and we're going to cut all this. Let's also understand that we're still going to spend $3.5 trillion with a capital T. That's a lot of money. You know, if people often ask me, they say, well, how much is $1 trillion? It's kind of a hard number to get your arms around. But if you were to spend $1 million a day, every day, it would take you almost 3,000 years to get to 1 trillion. To 1 trillion. Well, we're $14 trillion in debt. We're paying more than $600 million a day in interest on that debt. It's on its way to $1 billion a day in just the interest on that debt. And we're going to have to deal with the fact that we got to pay that debt. We got to cut up the government credit card. We have spent far too much money. What I like about what we have proposed in the Republican budget is that we start to rein in the out-of-control spending, yet we still fulfill a lot of the obligations that we have to this country, particularly for seniors and others. We will still spend an exorbitant amount of money, but over the course of time, we will be on the proper trajectory to live within our means. I think that's one of the foundations of this country, is the idea of personal responsibility, the idea that we have to live within our means, that we are self-sufficient. And we're going to have to deal with the fact that in Congress's generations previous, they have racked up this debt. And we can go through it and blame each other for that. But the reality moving forward is we have to put ourselves on a trajectory to balance the budget and pay off the debt. And that, I think, is one of the great moral responsibilities that we have in the United States Congress, the adult conversation that we have. There are a lot of needs in this country. But we're broke, ladies and gentlemen. We're broke. And we have got to rein in the spending. And we have got to make the United States as competitive as we can possibly be. Because when we're competitive on the world stage, the United States of America is still the greatest country on the face of the planet. But if we're going to be the military and economic superpower, we have a responsibility to live within our means and to become self-sufficient. I'll reserve the balance of my time, Madam
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield myself 10 seconds to just say when progress is made, someone is always left behind. And my concern is that it's always the vulnerable. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bobby Scott.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Congressional Black Caucus has a long history of submitting fiscally responsible budget alternatives, regardless of who may be sitting in the White House or which party holds the majority in Congress. This year's budget alternative continues this long tradition by putting forth a plan that significantly reduces our deficit over the next decade while increasing economic opportunities and promoting job creation in every corner of our society. Unlike the Republican budget, the CBC budget brings the deficit to 1.4% of GDP by 2015, better than so-called primary balance, which was the goal of the President's Fiscal Commission, and achieves primary balance even earlier than the Commission itself. While I commend the Republican chairman of the Budget Committee for proposing a budget that reduces our long-term debt, he only achieves this by shifting medical costs to lower-income Americans and seniors. The CBC budget is much more responsible. Our budget makes tough choices, but unlike the Republican budget, it doesn't jeopardize Social Security, undermine Medicaid by turning it into a block grant, or shift Medicare costs to seniors by creating a voucher program that doesn't keep pace with medical inflation. Our budget protects these vital programs, and compared to the Republican budget, has $1.3 trillion more in deficit reduction over the next decade. The CBC budget proposes responsible revenue increases by closing corporate loopholes and preferences, deterring aggressive stock speculation, which helped contribute to the 2008 financial crisis, and ensuring that the wealthiest Americans who benefited most from the tax cuts and bailouts in the last decades pay their fair share. Now, with the additional revenues and assuming some of the cuts proposed in the President's budget, the CBC budget uses 80% of the additional revenue for deficit reduction and then invests the rest to protect from making the cuts in our safety net programs like WIC or community health centers, avoiding cuts and investments in our future like Head Start, Pell Grants, high-speed rail, and NASA, reduces cuts in critical functions like clean water, FBI agents, and food inspections, and has more for national defense, homeland security, and our veterans. Our budget also fully funds an additional 14 weeks of emergency unemployment benefits for those who have exhausted their benefits, often referred to as the 99ers. Now, Madam Chair, the CBC budget protects our social safety net. It invests in our future. It maintains essential services and national security. It does all of this and has more deficit reduction than the underlying Republican budget. So we have a choice. We can have lower deficits and a better future, or we can have tax cuts for multimillionaires and oil companies. I urge my colleagues to make the right choice and support the Cleaver amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the freshman gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The House budget that we're proposing tonight from Republicans is a budget that will take discretionary spending back to the pre-2008 level and begins to deal with our spending issue that we have as a nation. We've increased our discretionary spending 25% over the last 2 years. We're trying to move it back to where we were a few years ago and then allow that to be able to grow with inflation. We're focusing on freezing in the federal workforce. It's a recommendation done by the President's own debt commission, and taking that issue on that the President and the debt commission gave to say, how do we need to handle our federal workforce as it has increased by 140,000 just in a single year on that. And it begins to walk through the process of what do we do at our social safety net to make sure that social safety net is still there in the years to come. We believe that there needs to be a social safety net, but as our chairman has said multiple times, that safety net should be a safety net, not a hammock. And it should allow people to be able to go through that process to find a safe place and a safe harbor for people for a period of time until they're able to get back on their feet. That's a good thing for us to be able to do as Americans, and we need to find ways to be able to protect that in the days to come. But part of the struggle that we have with that is finding ways that that doesn't become a place where people are trapped indefinitely. So we'd like to be able to implement some of the reforms of the Clinton era time when with temporary assistance for needy families was transitioned in, that has become such a great success on helping families be able to transition into work. The best way we can take care of families that are in the poverty area is not a program from the government. It is a great job that they have great self-esteem and they can be engaged and be a part of our ongoing economy. The President's own debt commission made the comment that the nation is broke, and that what we need to do is focus in on reducing spending and dealing with how we handle what we do as a nation and what we're trying to accomplish. As far as the issues about Medicare, we've been very clear through this process. We're dealing with Medicare changes for those that are 54 years old and younger. And for those that are in poverty and facing disability, those individuals would have a full coverage, and that as they're more wealthy, yes, we would means test that. We have an expectation that wealthier senior adults would be able to help cover more of their own Medicaid or their own Medicare, but for those that are in poverty or near the poverty range, they would be supplementing more to make sure that we're taking care of them, and it would be a guaranteed coverage like they have now, that they don't have to worry about not being able to get to Medicare. They would be able to have it, and that would be secured for them. And we have one more major thing that we've all discussed. We all want taxes to be more simple in the process. Tomorrow is April 15th, all of our favorite day in America, dealing with the taxes and dealing with the process. And it's not a matter of being a great citizen. It's just a matter of going through the tax forms. We need to simplify this process and to make it more flat, more level, more fair for people across the board. So that's a major part of it. We're not talking about raising taxes $6 trillion. We're talking about keeping tax rates where they are and finding a way to be able to honor people, honor families, and honor our rate. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Madam Chair, how much time remains for both sides, please?
The gentleman from Missouri has 8.5 minutes remaining.
Madam Chair, I would now reserve 2 minutes for the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Gwendolyn Moore.
Thank you so
the
much, Mr.
gentlewoman
Cleaver.
from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Congressional Black Caucus, the conscience of the Congress, rejects cuts that wage a war on the poor and a war on the working class. There are 43 of us from 21 states. We represent over 30 million people. And we are aggrieved that 2/3 of the Republican budget cuts come from programs that serve low-income and working-class people, while there is no sacrifice from the uber-wealthy class. It is our job to be a voice in the wilderness and point out that it is downright immoral to choose tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and billions of dollars of tax breaks and tax subsidies rather than preserving the dignity of a life in decent housing, food security, and access to health care for all Americans. The gentleman, the previous speaker, just pointed out that they're cutting welfare because they believe that people need self-esteem. Well, you cannot eat self-esteem, and you cannot live in a house built on self-esteem. We want you to know that half of Americans in this country are barely making it without any governmental support, and that they need Medicaid. They don't need you to block grant it. Block granting means a cut. Block granting food stamps means a cut. Privatizing Medicare is a cut. Inflicting deep cuts to the low-income heating energy assistance program and denying extended benefits to the unemployed is a cut. And yet, the Congressional Black Caucus prioritizes controlling the debt and deficit. We cut it by $4 trillion over 10 years. We, the CBC, submit that conservative fiscal policy is compatible with compassion for the invisible, voiceless majority of Americans that need their government to respond. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Young.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's been much discussion today about shared sacrifice. The notion of shared sacrifice, let's disaggregate that for a moment. We might have shared sacrifice for the next generation. We certainly are contemplating that right now if we fail to act in a responsible manner and address our nation's debt crisis. Shared sacrifice for the current unemployed and the underemployed in our country. That is what we're contemplating if our solution to our nation's problems is merely to increase taxes. We're going to see a decrease in job creation in this country. We'll actually see us go in the other direction in terms of employment in this country if we implement, as is proposed in this substitute, a tax increase of almost $6 trillion as compared to the budget that we are embracing on the Republican side. We're imposing all manner of unnecessary sacrifice under this substitute on Americans that are currently working, middle-class Americans. It contemplates a tax increase on capital gains and dividends at ordinary income rates. What that means, essentially, is we are thinking of taxing pension and mutual funds at a rate as high as 49%. That would adversely impact our seniors. It's not the responsible thing to do. We're also contemplating, here in this proposal, allowing all tax provisions of the 2001 and 2003 deals to expire for all taxpayers. In other words, this is a tax increase, proposed tax increase on middle-class Americans. I don't think that's the right thing to do right now. And let's remind ourselves, we cannot tax our way out of this spending problem. Washington, once again, does not have a tax problem. We're not in this mess because we're not taxing the American people enough. We're instead in this mess because we're spending far too much. This will become a familiar chart for Americans around the country, I hope, but let's look at this. This is the ski slope of future spending projections, according to our Office of Management and Budget and Congressional Budget Office, if we do nothing. Those on the other side are seemingly proposing that we continue along this course or try and remedy this situation through job-constraining tax increases. That's not the way to go. And finally, one statistic that was cited earlier tonight bears reiterating. If we were to tax everyone in this country who makes $250,000 or more, every family in this country, so that's just two income earners at the $125,000 level, at 100% of their income, we still could not improve our financial situation enough to restore private sector job creation and put ourselves back on a path to prosperity. That is why I think we need to embrace this Ryan budget. Thank you so much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Madam Chair, I reserve 1 minute from the gentleman from Texas, Al Green.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The American people are confronting a dilemma. And the dilemma is simply this: to privatize or not to privatize. When all is said and done, that's the dilemma that we face based upon what the opposing party proposes. The simple solution to education is to simply privatize and give them vouchers. The simple solution to Social Security is to privatize and place it in the stock market. The simple solution to health care is to privatize and give them vouchers. For every complicated problem, there is a simple solution that's usually wrong. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Chair, I would just say that we don't offer a proposal to privatize Social Security. We do not do the things that were just said on this floor. Nevertheless, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Indiana and recognize him for 3 minutes, Mr. Rokita.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise also tonight to talk a little bit about the size and the scope and the amount of employees that this federal government has. Now, earlier tonight, I talked about the state from which I come from, Indiana. AAA bond rating, not raising taxes on anybody, and a budget that year after year has been in the black. As Secretary of State for Indiana for the last 8 years, I've operated a bureaucracy. I know a little bit about them. And what we have in Indiana, at least in the Secretary of State's office, was a pretty darn good one. We had no more employees in the Indiana Secretary of State's office than we did in the early 80s. We were running on a 1987 budget, unadjusted for inflation. And I can tell by the reaction of some of the members here in the House tonight, it's one of derision. It's one of scoffing. It can be done. The states know how to do it. Let's look to them. In contrast to Indiana, what do we see here at the federal level? 155,000 more bureaucrats than just a few years ago. An 80+% increase in the size and scope of this federal government, Madam Chairman, and that's just the personnel. We can have cuts in each of these departments. Every bureaucrat that we don't hire after one retires will cause a 10% decrease in the federal workforce over just a few years. That's responsible governing, especially when you're talking about a $14 trillion debt. Trillion-dollar year after year deficits. And as the previous Republican speaker, my friend Todd Young, pointed out, it's just getting worse. The red menace is upon us, and it's the red ink produced in this federal government right here from the well of this House to begin with. The Ryan proposal that came out of the Budget Committee addresses this in a responsible manner. The smaller we make this federal government, the more the private sector grows. It's correlational, it's definitional. I urge my colleagues to pass this budget proposal, the Ryan proposal, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Yvette Clarke.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the chairman for the time. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of the Congressional Black Caucus budget alternative, which lays out what I truly believe to be a more responsible way forward. In stark contrast to the irresponsible and reckless cuts proposed by the majority in the Ryan budget, the CBC budget alternative recognizes that not only can we not cut and slash our way to prosperity on the backs of our nation's most vulnerable while protecting tax cuts for multimillionaires, but we also must invest in our nation's future. Our proposal creates jobs by investing in the green economy, diminishing our dependence on foreign oil, invests in our future by supporting programs that make education from the cradle to college more affordable and protects the most vulnerable Americans. Madam Speaker, it's time that we have an honest conversation with the American people about where we are. The greatest wealth transfer from the poor and the middle class to the rich and the wealthy in our lifetime. How we got here: Bush tax cuts, subprime scamming, and financial sector greed. And how we get to fiscal solvency by supporting the CBC budget alternative. We are the conscience of the Congress.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'd like to inquire as to how much time each side had and how many speakers there might be left. We have no additional speakers except myself.
We'll be happy, Madam Speaker, to take the rest of his time.
From Utah has 3 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Missouri has 4.5 minutes remaining.
Madam Chair, I would like to reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves.
Madam Speaker, I would now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, a certified physician, Dr. Donna Christensen.
Thank you,
the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Congressional Black Caucus's budget, which is responsible and responsive to the needs of all Americans, especially those who have been ignored and underserved in these hard economic times. We reject the Republican budget while providing giveaways to the rich and corporations, send seniors and people with disabilities out into the private insurance market with vouchers that will not cover and so will increase their costs, and that reopens the dread donut hole. The CBC budget preserves Medicare, strengthens and extends it, and ends the donut hole. Republicans would cut Medicaid, denying health care to Americans who need prevention and care most, continuing the spiral of excess disabilities, illness, and premature death. Our budget fully funds Medicaid and the Prevention and Public Health Fund, ensuring health care and the chance for wellness, which many would not have without them. We robustly fund HIV and AIDS, WIC, maternal and child health, and other programs to close gaps and bring better health to minorities, the poor, and Americans in rural areas and the territories. Unlike the Republican budget, we create millions of jobs, bring down costs, and further reduce the deficit. Vote for the CBC budget. Reject the harmful Republican budget.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Madam Chair, we have no additional speakers, but I would like to reserve the right to close, and so I'll reserve the balance of my time at this
The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, the ranking member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Congressman Elijah Cummings.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in strong support of the Congressional Black Caucus budget. As a senior member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and as a former chairman of the committee's subcommittee on the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, I know that budget cuts do not build bridges. They also do not repair roads, and they do not expand our transit systems. Unlike the majority's proposed budget, which threatens to bring our transportation networks to a standstill, the CBC alternative budget invests $20 billion above the President's budget in highways, transit, high-speed rail, and bridges. Such an investment in our nation's infrastructure will move our recovering economy forward while creating at least 1 million jobs. Such investments will also ensure the mobility of our constituents so they can keep moving forward. The CBC alternative budget makes the investments in economic growth our nation's needs, and I urge all members to vote in favor of the Congressional Black Caucus budget. And with that, Madam Chair, I
The
yield
gentleman's
back.
time has expired. The gentleman from Utah continues to reserve. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield now 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Danny Davis.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the Ryan Plan and in favor of the CBC budget. The CBC budget invests heavily in the education of our youngest citizens from preschool to graduate school. This investment is necessary to ensure that all children receive the world-class education they so greatly need and rightly deserve. This investment is necessary to build the early childhood education system we need to improve school readiness and reduce achievement gaps among students from different backgrounds. This investment is necessary to teach critical math and science skills, to improve graduation rates, and to provide for crucial college preparation programs such as TRIO and Gear Up, all of which are essential for success in our technological world. Madam Speaker, education is a civil right issue, and unless we educate all of our children, this country will never be what it ought to be. I support the CBC budget and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Chair,
The gentleman from Utah is
my understanding is
recognized.
I have 3 additional minutes. I'm happy to yield an additional minute. I know you've got additional speakers. I'd like to yield them one minute of our
The
time.
gentleman from Utah yields 1 minute. The gentleman from Missouri.
Let me thank the gentleman from Utah.
The gentleman now has 2½ minutes.
I yield now, Madam Speaker, 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chair. I thank the gentleman from Utah for yielding to the CBC. The CBC budget saves $325 billion in interest over 10 years, which the Republican budget does not. I am glad to stand here and talk about ports and public transit, but I'm even more glad to talk about the $5 billion that goes into general sciences, space and technology, and the $5 billion for community development. The reason why I want to say that is, for all of the tax cuts to the wealthy, $800 billion, the CBC budget understands that they can invest in health, income security, education, and transportation. In addition, may I say to you that this is the face of what we're trying to fight for: a hardworking nurse and a beautiful child. This is what America is all about. And I would just say to my good friends, the CBC budget does not engage in slashonomics. It does not engage in losing jobs, jobs, jobs. We create jobs through community block grants, through space, science, and technology, to transportation, and all the bill for the Republicans will do to America is slash jobs, slashonomics. Vote for the CBC budget. I yield back.
The gentleman from Utah continues to reserve. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Madam Speaker, in closing, I'm not accusing anybody of being mean-spirited and wanting to hurt people. I am absolutely convinced that those who support the Republican budget are good and decent Americans and want the best thing for this country. I will never stand on this floor and do that. What I am saying is that I believe, and our caucus believes, that their program, their budget, is one that does damage to the vulnerable population of this country. And we believe that somebody must stand up and speak for those who are hurting and cannot speak for themselves. A budget is a moral document. It is a photograph of what we believe. It is a look into the somebodyness of the United States of America. And when we look at this budget that this Congress will ultimately approve, some budget, it is who we are. It is a biography of who we are. And I am absolutely convinced that the wrong budget, and I think the budget that is before us is the wrong budget, could create a gash on the soul of America and leave a scar for a long, long time. Madam Speaker, this is a time that we must be careful, because if we are not, great damage will be done to the people who can afford the damage the least. I'm talking about children, I'm talking about the elderly, and I'm talking about Americans who live next door to us, people who sit on the pew with us in church. These are people who are going to be hurt by this budget. And I think that the American public, when they come to understand this budget, will come to the conclusion that we're right. And with that, Madam Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. The United States of America is the greatest country on the face of the planet. We have overcome challenge after challenge for hundreds of years. And what makes America great is that entrepreneurial spirit, that can-do attitude, that idea that was inspired in the Constitution. I believe that the Constitution is an inspired sacred document. But if we're going to continue to maintain our being as the world's economic and military superpower, we're going to have to change the trajectory on which we're doing business. Taxing, spending, borrowing money, that is not the pathway to prosperity. The American dream is built upon the ideal that people need to take care of themselves. There is a proper role of government. And what we truly need in this country is fiscal discipline, limited government, accountability, and a strong national defense. And the Republican budget that has been put forward puts us on that trajectory to retain and regain that fiscal sanity that we so desperately need in this country. Not only does our budget balance over the course of time, but it actually pays off the debt. And that, I think, and I believe, is what we should be doing, and what this budget that is put forth by the Budget Committee here on the Republican side of the aisle truly does. We have a moral obligation to leave this country better than how we found it. And if we're going to truly drive jobs and the economy forward, we're going to have to recognize that we need to empower the individual. We need to empower the entrepreneur so that they can be the very best that we can in a very competitive global climate. And so, Madam Chair, I would urge the passage of the Republican budget, and I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this alternative that's been put forward during this last half hour. I've enjoyed the debate. It's what makes this country great. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman from Missouri request the yeas and the nays? The recorded vote?
Yes.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri will be postponed.